for being here first. So this is a talk about an example of a protocol that we're going to run partially off-chain. And the protocol is useful. You don't, it's a general principle, but here I'm going to stick to that PDP example. And I guess the general idea is that you're trying to keep the costs of running the protocol at the lowest possible, provided all players in the contract are honest players. So the idea is it's very similar to the talk we've seen before, in the sense that there will be players and there will be a chain to resolve potential conflicts. But the way it's designed is that if there is no conflict, which happens for some kind of risk profile, then you pay nothing, and it's very fast as well. All right. So here it's a two-player contract, and the idea is that one player has data, and another player wants to buy it. So the player selling the data will be S like selling or server, and S serves that piece of data item that A wants to A at the price that is agreed on and under a condition which will be materialized by a predicate P, and I'll describe a little later what that predicate could mean. For now, it will be abstract. So this is not a matching algorithm, so the server and the buyer already know what they want to do. They've already narrowed down to definition of the swap that they want to achieve between them. So it's all just about how you're going to settle that swap cheaply and fairly. Of course, we don't trust any party, so there's a problem. Because if A pays first, then it may be that A never gets the data from S. And conversely, if S sends the data in an optimistic way, then it may be that the buyer actually never sends back the money. So we have to do something about this. So it's about scaling, but it's economic scaling, so it's interesting. So let me elaborate on this for a minute. So we have a three-player game to implement the two-player game. The third player is not really a player, it's a smart contract, like in the talk before, and I'm going to call that smart contract M. And M is the trusted third party, which runs on the chain, and will be able to solve challenges from either players, if there are any. So there are two constraints here. One is that the trusted third party is not any trusted third party, it's not very confidential, because you can see everything it does. So we have to design around this. So we have to be careful that, for example, the data is not written on the chain, because it would defeat the purpose, right? If it was made public, there would be no point to try to sell it anymore. And it's also expensive, like I said, so it should be used sparingly. So the idea is that the honest path of interaction should cost nothing. I refined that idea. So when is that a useful way to think about things beyond that particular example of someone selling data to someone else? Well, the idea is that it's for a certain type of risk profile. Yeah, you can run a contract off chains, so the story goes. If the players have a type of risk, so they don't trust each other, that's one thing, but they're also rather unlikely to cheat each other all the time. Maybe most of the time it's fine, and then every now and then there's an attempt at a big fraud. So this is this type of business-like risk profile that we're thinking of. And in that case, trading off simplicity for honest path against cost and complexity for deviations from the honest path is a good way to frame things. So one way to say this again is to say that the cost of repairing, which we need because we can trust players, will be high only if there is need to repair. So now I'm going to list the properties that we want of our protocol before we solve the problem. So we want the PDP to be fair or atomic in the equivalent terms. That means that one party gets what he or she wants if and only if the other one does. There is no, of course, no guarantee that the protocol will go through, but if it does, it will be in a fair fashion. Second should be dedicated, so that's on the seller side. You don't want everyone to know to learn the data. Only the one that's only the one player who's actually buying it. And the data should be correct according to the predicate, P. And finally, and this is perhaps the fun part, the protocol should be economically sound, which means that for every negative or deviating or inconclusive trace which deviates from the honest path, there should be a unique culprit which is identified by the contract. And that party, who is the cheating party, is going to have to bear the costs of everything in the protocol. So to be detailed. And the honest path is a dominant strategy for both players and hence for the aggregate players. So a rational adversary will not deviate. All right, so now I tell you what the model is. So we suppose that both parties have an encrypted, authenticated channel between them, which is not trivial, but we assume this. We suppose there's a contract sitting on chain that we're going to describe below. So to the description of the protocol, I will use solid arrows for any communication from the players to the contract. And I will use dashed ones for off-chain communications. And there will be no communications from the contract to the players. There will be just money transfers from the contract to the players. I will also assume that the contract is an unbounded session counter, because there could be replay attacks, multi-session attacks. So we need to have session numbers, Q-ish, unique session numbers. And I will also assume, so that's not trivial, it's not actually implemented in Ethereum, for example, although it would be an interesting addition, but it can be simulated. I will also assume that the contract can set timeouts, a little bit like a cron daemon. So that means that the contract can self-awake every, delta blocks and inspect if something has happened in the meantime. You can simulate this by triggering that with a transaction, but it's easier used as a primitive like that. And I'm going to constantly, meaning the mother contract is going to constantly set timeouts for obvious reasons. All right, so the protocol breaks down in 4 parts, very small parts, each of them. So there is an economic preamble. This is where people put their money, and we're going to see it in a second. Then there is an off-chain communication part. Then there is on-chain commitment from the seller. So this is an asymmetric protocol. Seller is actually behaving differently than buyer. I've not given much thought about whether we could do it the other way. It would be an interesting exercise. And finally, there's the epilogue, which is the time where the buyer is given, so the seller commits on the chain to a key, and then the buyer is given, Alice, is given a chance to challenge whether the data that the seller gave off-chain to Alice is actually correct. So this is the epilogue. It's a challenge-response protocol. So in the little depiction that I'm going to use, the transitions of the protocol are labeled by value transfers. I think the notation is pretty intuitive. And I put a little delta timeout on the mother contract each time the mother contract M sets up a new timeout. So mostly we look at the protocol from the point of view of the smart contract, because the smart contract is calling the shots, is making the decision, is validating challenges or not, depending. And also it's a good way to think about the problem from the proof point of view, because the mother contract does not see what's off-chain. So you have to not believe that something that should happen off-chain has happened off-chain. All right. So let's look at the economic preamble. So that's easy. The principle is that both parties provisions for being sued by the other party. So the idea is that if you sell me something which is worth €1, and I have to spend €10 to sue you or to challenge you because you didn't give me the one thing I wanted to buy, then there's a problem, right? It's not worth my time or my money rather to sue you to get back my €1. So one trivial way to correct for this is to ask people to provision for being sued by the other party. So that's what we do. So both players do this. The mother contract increments the session counter to protect the session, as I said, and sets a first timeout, waiting on the other player provisioning as well. And then when the other player has provisioned, then the mother contract sets a second timeout, waiting for the commit move of the next phase. So it looks like this. The two steps commute, but let's say Alice starts by saying, I want to buy this thing. So on the arrow to the mother contract, you see that the mother contract in the second step triggers a timeout. So the clock starts running, waiting for the next move. And Alice actually provisions CS. So CS is the amount of money S, the seller, will need to sue Alice if there is a problem. So I'll discuss what that amount is. Of course, it's not known in advance, right? Because costs are stochastic. We'll return to this. And A is the agreed on price for the piece of data that eventually everything change to just set up the transaction. So all the epsilons and the deltas is for deployment if you want, will be considered to be negligible, but I still want to trace them to check the economics of the various interaction paths. So the mother contract receives this, sets the timeout. If S plays its own provisioning move before the clock timeout, delta 1 now, and here there will be a little invisible segment between the interaction with the two players, and we're waiting for the next interaction with the contract. That's the only thing the contract can say anything about. Okay. So off-chain now. Off-chain, what happens, this is fun, is that the seller sends the encrypted data. You cannot send the data, right? Because that would be trusting Alice too much. So you send the encrypted data, and you also send the session identifier, and you encrypt everything with a one-time key. And the idea is that me, the seller, I'm going to reveal this on chain, and you are the only person having the encrypted data, so you'll be the only person able to decrypt it. So this is for the dedicatedness property. So I do this with my one-time key, and then there's a key step, which may not be completely obvious, which comes from working out the proof, which is that Alice, off-chain, has to return an authenticated acknowledgement of receipt of the encrypted data. Well, we'll see why it's important. It's actually critical. So Alice returns off-chain to the seller something that later can be used as a proof that Alice has received the actual piece of data that the server sent. So this is the way it works. I'm going to call M the authenticated encrypted data, which is timestamped. And so now let's see, why is it so important that Alice sends back this receipt? So remember, the mother contract does not see the off-chain moves. So we need to protect Alice, the buyer, from the seller skipping, sending absolutely nothing, and just putting a random key on the chain at the next step. So it has to be that the seller can only proceed if Alice has said, okay, I received something. So that's the first thing. But then duly, we need to protect the seller against Alice. Receive something. So this will be taking care of one interaction path, which is a challenge of Alice about the lack of data. There will be another one which is about the quality of data, you'll see. Okay, so now we finally go to something is happening. It's interesting to see that so far in the protocol, nothing has happened. Players as provision, they may have or may not have talked off-chain, but no player, and actually to the point, Alice has not learned anything about what she wants to buy yet, which means that the timeout can time out in peace because nothing has happened information-wise. So now it's time for us to commit. So as we said, S publishes on-chain, something that's visible from all players, and then the mother contract sets up a timeout, and that's a different timeout. It's a timeout post that commitment from the seller, and it's a timeout that can be much longer, depending on the application, which is the time we give to Alice to post a challenge to the interaction, or to challenge that the path followed by the players was honest. Here I'm using honest in a technical way, right? It means just as in the protocol, right? You may be honest and not technically honest because you're just, making a mistake or something. So this is the commitment. So you authenticate, of course, the key, and the key means nothing to anyone except maybe for Alice if she actually received a message that was encrypted with that key. Everyone sees it, and we've said all that. And now we enter the interesting phase, which is the epilogue. It remains just one move for Alice to play in the game tree, and so it breaks down in 4 possible cases. Either A agrees, everything is fine. So concretely, it means that she now sees the key on the chain. She has a piece of data that was sent to her, so she can decrypt, test the validity according to the predicate, convince herself that everything is fine, and then post on the chain, okay, it's 1 bit of information, I'm fine. Or, if A is not fine, A can challenge. So as we said, you can challenge because you did not receive the data. So you look up the chain, which means concretely that you did not acknowledge receipt of the data, right? You may have received the data, actually we'll never know. But if you did not acknowledge the receipt, then the server S was stupid because he was not honest in the technical sense. He did not wait for your acknowledgement. So by now, if you have the data, everything is fine, you have not sent your receipt and the keys on the chain, it's easy to not pay. You have the data and you just say, I didn't receive it. And there's nothing anyone can do about it. The mother contract cannot save you. So, that's just the seller being reckless, not cautious, not following the protection offered by the protocol. So you can, so let's return to the enumeration. So you can say, I did not receive anything, you're Alice here. Or you can say, I received something, but it's not proper. So you can challenge the quality of the data. And of course, you can always not do anything at all. And this is why the timeout delta 2 is in place, which will entitle S to get the money after delta 2 blocks have elapsed. So let's look at them one by one. So this is A agreeing, and you send this thing, I agree, and then the reaction of the mother contract is to transfer the funds. So you give back the provisions to both players. CA goes to S. No one sued anyone, so that's fine. We get back the suing money. M pays back the money that A provisions to be sued by S. And then A, which is the price of the data, goes to the seller. And also, if you look at the balance of things, you see that A has paid minus A, S has received A, and the mother contract has received epsilon, and so the aggregate transaction for the players, from the point of view of the game, we're emulating on the chain, is minus epsilon, so it costs nothing, to be honest. I mean, just the, well, concretely it costs to say yes, and to post a key. Okay, so interesting. Now suppose A challenges us on the data. So on the data not being of the proper quality. So if the challenge is valid, then you fully refund A, which means not only does Alice get back her money, but Alice also gets back the money that was spent to challenge. And that comes from the provision of the other player. So that's cool. And if you look at the aggregate balance of this is not as good, right? We have to pay now. So the culprit has paid, which you can see because he has lost minus CA. The culprit has paid, but from the overall system, the contract has spent more money than in the preceding case. So as we said, you pay when something goes wrong. But this penalty or additional cost is incurred by the culprit. So it's kind of fair. And more to the point, it's a disincentive to deviate. So the point here is that there is no reason S should send corrupt data because it will not achieve what he wants, presumably, which is to sell. So we'll get no money, and we'll have, in addition, to pay for being sued, right? This is the beginning of the argument of the dominant strategy. Okay, so this was A, challenges on data in a valid way. Now, if the challenge is invalid, then you imagine what we do. We do the opposite. So now it is A, which pays for the cost of suing, and the balance from S is that he gets the money. So in that case, maybe the data is not actually correct. There's no way to tell. But what we can say is that if the data was incorrect, then Alice was clumsy because she didn't post a correct challenge, right? So, same principle. All right, now what does it mean that the data is valid? Here we have to say something, right? It's a computation which is concretely written in the contract. So obviously, validity is computed by the mother contract. So if X is the challenge posted by Alice, then first of all, we have to check that the challenge is well formed. So we have to check that it's of the form secret key of S applied to X and T, where T is the proper session identifier. And so we extract the S, which is the payload of that challenge. And now we pass this to the predicate. So we apply the K. So what does it mean? The mother contract has seen that K, right? Because K is the key that was posted by S. We're past that point in the execution path. So the mother contract has a key. There's no clue whether the key actually was the key that was used to encode X, the cargo. So it just applies that key, that symmetric key, and then check with the validity predicate whether that has the proper expected property. Return to, at that point, what are the concrete property we want. But this is the chain of checks that the validity challenge triggers. Okay, so that predicate, once we've correctly opened the cargo and then we check the validity of something with the key submitted by S, could be, for example, an obligation of results. So it could be that delta 2 is quite long and we extracted, let's say, a prediction So the data maybe says something about a future event. Based on that future event, I'm betting, I'm A, and then the event actually happens, and I use some kind of oracle, and I compare the actual outcome to the predicted outcome, and depending, on the contract, that's on a per contract basis, I may take the decision that this is invalid, right? So that the prediction was far away from the actual outcome, and so, something, I'm not going to pay or something. It could be a swap with another chain, let's say a Bitcoin chain, where the piece of data is actually a transaction which moves Bitcoins from the seller or anyone, actually, who cares, a proper transaction that moves to an address that was submitted by Alice in the very first step. And then the checking here is to, or the invalidity test here is for Alice to fail to inject her transaction in the side chain and to exhibit a proof of failure by fishing in the transaction pool on the other side, a double spend by the seller. So here it's actually the negation of validity, which is provable. It's by counterexample. You see that transaction was not correct because here's another one, and it's a double spending. Which means, so when I said the timeout could be long, the timeout has the length of the time it takes for Alice to, or the reasonable time it takes, because it's stochastic, for Alice to actually mount a challenge if Alice was cheated. So it all depends on the case. Another remark here, which kind of frames when you like to use this kind of technique, is that the data can be absolutely gigantic. It doesn't matter because it's moved off-chain. But when you start challenging, what you actually challenge with, if it was a giant file, then that would cost a lot, which means that the provisioning for suing, so the CA, which is provisioned by S to be challenged, would be at least the cost of the memory footprint of the data on the chain. So it would be a little bizarre, it would be like, give me that movie, I pay you €5, but for me to do this, you have to provision, I don't know, 1,000 Ether. Or why not? If you're certain that you're not going to be dishonest, so you have to be careful. So if as I said, the honest path is dominant. So if Alice falsely challenges in a case like this, Alice will have to pay this enormous amount of money. So maybe it's not this type of application that we have in mind, but it works. So now it remains to check the challenges on no data. So, maybe I'm going to go over this quickly. So we actually talked about this already. So it could be that S didn't actually send anything off-chain. So in that case, Alice will challenge. And now it's a response. Either the seller says, no, I did send this, and proof is that you acknowledged it, and here's it. So the mother contract can perfectly check that proof. It's easy. It's signed. So that's what's written here. And you need a little delta-free timeout to let the seller respond to that challenge. And if the challenge is proper, meaning the seller has absolutely no way to counterclaim, then the money, Alice will be refunded, whether she actually received the data or not. That's the remark we made before. But if she did, and she can challenge successfully, this means the seller is an idiot. Okay. So, okay, this is just the thing I said, and this is the other thing. So now a bit of comments to conclude. So about the economic dominance of being honest. So we see that the agreeing is for Alice is always a dominant, economically dominant strategy. For example, if we compare with not responding at all, we see that in the latter case, Alice pays the cost of the seller triggering the timeout. So it's of no interest to Alice, and it doesn't change anything for the server. So A is incentivized to keep on the rational, the honest path, which is rational. So we have all these properties that I repeat here. Most notably, the fact that being honest is economically dominant, which is interesting. With parameters, which we talked about already. There's a problem of estimating fees, which is not reduced here. Fees can be varying because the system is congested and blah blah. So you know that as well as I do. And now I want to conclude with that funny little slide, which I call players versus the chain. So honest path is dominant for the players, which is good, but it's actually terrible for the chain because the chain actually makes money when players misbehave. So, it makes money out of bad behavior. But by this don't get paranoid principle, you only actually pay the chain, the miners, whoever the stakeholders, only if the players misbehave. So there's a kind of a disalignment between the money the chain wants to make, if you wish, and the money the players wants to make. So, but nevertheless, you can hope that having loads of well-oiled, zero contention smart contracts where every player is happy will accumulate into tiny little epsilons that will amount to more money than just profiting off bad players. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.